Thanks,
Donnelly,
Minister, for your comprehensive response. And again, I appreciate the spirit in which you're trying to set these limits, and I appreciate that you have a very delicate balance to try and achieve. I guess the position that I'm hearing is that it has to be that long, it has to be 5 or 6 years to make it worth the while of the banks or the other creditors, but certainly the creditors.
A lot of other creditors out there.
Yeah,
it's
no,
not
I appreciate
all banks.
that. No, absolutely, I appreciate that. But it has to be, we have to make it worth their while. And again, therefore, in a business as usual situation, I don't think these are necessarily unreasonable. However, we do know how the banks have been behaving to date. We're all dealing with it in our constituencies. FLAC, New Beginning, MABS, and others are dealing with some really objectionable behaviour from the banks. I was dealing with a case late last night of the bank bringing solicitors in and not telling the borrower and scaring the daylights out of her with all sorts of threats. It's going on every day, and we're all very well aware of it. So, the amendments, as you know, Minister, are not to shorten the time permanently. They're for a time-limited period. This is in the spirit of clearing out the household debt. And therefore, whilst I didn't think you were necessarily going to accept my amendments, I would like to offer 3 ways in which the spirit of what I'm trying to achieve might be considered. Let's take a lady I met recently in Wicklow Town, where she bought a house. It's worth about 1/3 of what it was worth. She became very ill. As a result of her illness, she had to give up her job. She was 3 years out. She's ready to go back to work. There's no work there anymore. The bank is moving to take the property off her. I've looked at the numbers, and it's not sustainable. Now, in that situation, there is no public good to be served by keeping that lady in a 6-year process. We could argue the bank needs an incentive to make a deal with her, but if you put her into a 6-year process, she's not going to look for work necessarily. She's not going to try and better her own economic situation if she believes that everything she does is just going to be taken by the banks. So I believe there are an awful lot of current debts, unsustainable debts, for which the public good is best served by getting them out of that as quickly as possible. And certainly between yourself and Minister Noonan, there is additional pressure, obviously, that can be brought to bear on the banks, many of which we own, and actually we can instruct to act as we see fit. So here's what I would like to suggest for your consideration. 3 things. The first is that the settlement period begins from when the arrears started. I appreciate that there is potentially a moral hazard issue to that. However, it is, I believe, the situation that's used in the UK. What I would hate to see is a situation whereby the debt becomes unsustainable, somebody goes into arrears, they spend 6 months trying to work it out with the bank, they then go to the personal insolvency professional, there's then another several months' worth of negotiation, and it's a year after the debt becomes unsustainable that the 5 or 6 year period even begins. So I think that's something I'd like you to just take a look at, to get the period to start as quickly as possible. The second is, I think, potentially guidance from yourself and from the government. What is, of course, in the legislation is the phrase no more than 5 years or no more than 6 years. So, of course, deals of 1 year or 2 year or 3 years could be done. And I think, Minister, if you and the government were to provide very clear guidance to the personal insolvency professionals, to the courts, to the banks, to say, in situations where there is clearly no public good, as per the example I just gave, and there are many, many more, in these situations, it is your intention as Minister, and it is this government's intention, that the maximum duration periods would not be used. And I think what I am hoping to achieve in terms of job creation, economic growth, could be achieved through very clear direction from you, Minister, as to the use of the period. Because, of course, there is latitude in here for the PIPs and for the courts and for the debtors and creditors to use whatever period they see fit. The third piece, Minister, is around the additional income. I noticed in the debt relief notice that the amount of income that the person can take, we discussed it here a few minutes ago, is 50% of net income. So if you earn €1,000 a month, and let's say taxes and levies and so forth takes 500 of that, you get to keep 250 and you give 250 to the creditor. Now, if we have a situation where deals are done whereby during the 5 or 6 year period somebody has to give up half or more of the net amount to the bank, we're essentially talking about a marginal tax rate of 75, 80, 85%, right? 50% goes to the government, another 25, 30, 30% goes to the bank. You're left with 15, 20%. It's very clear that if we apply what would essentially be a marginal tax rate on new work of 80%, people aren't going to work. People aren't going to work the extra hours. They're not going to go back to college, get the extra qualifications, whatever it is, to increase their income, if essentially 85% of it goes to the government and to the banks. So there are the three things I'd like you to consider, Minister. Start the arrears as early as possible. Provide clear guidance that the legislation is setting a maximum of 5 and 6 years. We all know that the banks will drive. They will throw the most expensive lawyers and analysts and accountants they can at this to set precedent at the start. They will want to anchor these things at the maximum amount. Clear guidance from you on this would be incredibly useful, I think, to people with the unsustainable mortgages. And then if you could also provide some guidance as to leaving the debtor with sufficient income for additional income during the period that it really is worth their while upskilling, training, retraining, working very hard. Thank you.
Thank you. Tara.
Well, if I could reply to the Deputy, firstly, the example he gave of his constituent in Wicklow. The answer to that is blindingly obvious, and the financial institutions are going to have to properly address that issue. Where you have someone who has either no income or a reduced income, whose only asset is the family home, where the family home has dropped by 2/3 of its value, and where it's in negative equity, and where there's no other source of income or other asset that that individual has. A financial institution has two choices. They could try and repossess the home where there are arrears, and if they do, all they're going to realise when they sell it, if they can sell it at all, is the 1/3 of the value. They're not going to recoup the extra 2/3, and if that individual has no other assets, even if they're not willing to formally write off the outstanding debt, there's no way they'll ever recover it. Now, for individuals in that situation, there's one message, and one message only, to financial institutions, which is use the personal insolvency arrangement to effect what we call debt forgiveness, and which everyone outside this House refers to as you write off a portion of the capital debt. There's nothing to be gained by the bank in doing anything other than that. Indeed, they're better off doing it if the circumstances bring about a position where the individual can now start repaying both capital and interest on what remains of the capital debt, because the bank has saved the cost of repossessing a property, of securing the property, of engaging agents to sell the property, and possibly, because it's repossessed, it's going at an even lower price than market value. Now, if the banks start repossessing homes of individuals in those circumstances, all they're going to do is further undermine the security they have in other properties held, be it in the residential home mortgage sector, or indeed even in the purchase to rent or purchase to let sector. So what I want to say, and I've said this before and I'm going to say it yet again in this House, the financial institutions must use this legislation to engage with people whose financial circumstances are so burdened that there's no realistic possibility of them ever being able to discharge the capital sum due on their homes, where they're in negative equity, and where they can't afford to make the repayments. It's not about people who won't pay, it's about those who can't pay. And the personal insolvency arrangement is designed to ensure that in those circumstances, where it is appropriate, where it is fair and where it is reasonable, that individuals will retain their homes, and that's the benefit to the individuals, that they retain their homes, that there's a rearrangement of debt. Effectively, the personal insolvency arrangement is a form of personal examinership and recalibration of financial circumstances.